Numbers chapter 31. We all understand what's happening here. God has the nation of Israel encamped, as verse 12 would say, on the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. That means they are staring across the Jordan River at Jericho, the first stop in their conquest of Canaan. And they ended up there a couple months prior to entering into the land of promise. And it was an eventful couple of months, to say the least. We had 38 years of history, 38 years of wandering in the desert given to us in just a handful of chapters in the book of Numbers. And then we come to the last couple months in the history of the nation prior to entry into the promised land. And we're given 15 chapters to describe the events that were taking place in those final 2 months. That's chapters 22 through the end of the book, 36. So a lot of stuff happening here. In chapter 32, all attention turns toward land settlements. The first thing that we're going to see, chapter 32, is Reuben and Gad deciding they don't want to go into the land of promise. They get right to the border and they say, you know what, this is a nice place right where we're at. We like what we're seeing and we'd like to stay. And so they ask Moses' permission for that. They request to settle outside of the land of promise. Then you come to chapter 34, and that is the drawing up of the land boundaries, the borders for the land of Canaan. And besides that, you have chapters 33, 35, and 36, all covering some final points of order. So what I'm telling you is that chapter 31 really is the last big story that we get in the book of Numbers. And it is all about God tying up a loose end, and that loose end would be Midian. So let's begin reading in verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, verse 2, "Avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites. Afterward you shall be gathered to your people." So this takes us back to chapters 22 through 25. Everything that is happening now in chapter 31 is because of what took place in those chapters, 22 through 25. This is all because of the incident of Balaam, right? Balak, the king of Moab, hiring the false prophet Balaam to curse the nation of Israel. Israel had moved into Moab's territory en route to the promised land, and their reputation had preceded them. Israel had become very active militarily before the Lord brought them into Moab, and they had established themselves as a force to be reckoned with. That made Balak, the king of Moab, very nervous. Now, he did not know that God had already told the nation of Israel, don't harm Moab. I have a deal with Moab. I've given Moab a promise, so you're not to attack them. Balak doesn't know that. He doesn't know that if he just sits back and does nothing, him and his people are totally fine. And so, from a state of irrational fear and panic, he hires this false prophet, Balaam, to curse the nation of Israel and give him an advantage in a fight, in a battle, a military battle. Now, of course, we know the story. Balaam could not do that because you cannot curse what God has blessed. But Balaam, being the conniving little weasel that he was, after spending some time interacting with God, he cracked the code. He found the loophole. He figured out how it was that he could bring about the curse of God on the nation of Israel. He knew it wasn't something that he or any other person could do except for the nation of Israel themselves. He understood that God was holy, righteous, and just. And so his advice to Balak was, you don't want to take these folks on in a fight, a physical altercation. You don't want to get involved there. But if you can lead the nation away from their God spiritually, it will pull them out from underneath the protective blessing of God, and it will force God's hand to move in judgment against them. And so the plan was this: the Moabitish women and the Midianite women, they joined together, and they seductively strolled into town, appealing to the men there, the Jewish men in Israel's camp, and they seduced the men. They got them involved with sexual immorality and the idolatry that was associated with that. And of course, because God is just, he sent a plague. And that plague killed 24,000 Jewish men. 24,000. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 8 tells us that 23,000 fell in one day. So we take that to mean day one of that plague, 23,000 died, and then another 1,000 died the remaining day, or the following day, rather. Then we came to chapter 27, and we read about the death of Moses. And we found out that God, though he announced the death of Moses, he wanted Moses to stick around for a little while longer and help to oversee the transfer of power to Joshua. And now we come to chapter 31, verses 1 and 2, and we find out God had one more task for Moses in those final few months of the life of Moses. What the Lord wanted from Moses before he kicked the bucket was God wanted to use Moses to level his judgment, to execute vengeance on the nation of Midian. Now you'll notice in this chapter, he's not going to take down Moab. Moab was really the launching pad for the issues between chapters 22 and 25, but God keeps his promise to Moab, but he has no deal with Midian. And so he comes after Midian in vengeance. He chooses to judge the wickedness there that is in Midian, and all I can say is if the Moabites were smart, they would watch what the Lord does to the people of Midian, and they would straighten up, and they would fly right. Verse 3, so Moses spoke to the people, saying, arm men from among you for the war, that they may go against Midian to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian. Verse 4, you shall send 1,000 from each of the tribes of Israel to the war. Verse 5, so there were provided out of the thousands of Israel 1,000 from each tribe, 12,000 armed for war. So that's 12,000 men. That's what the Lord picked, 12,000 men. I probably shouldn't have to tell you that is not a large number, not at all. Of all of the people that Moses had at his disposal, which as of the second census, Numbers chapter 25, chapter 26, that was 601,730 fighting men. 601,730 soldiers, and Moses calls up only 12,000 for active duty against Midian. So that is 2% of Israel's military force. That's what God is, I believe, directing Moses to use here, 2% of their force. I say that because even though the Bible doesn't say it, I'm confident that's the case here. I'm confident that it wasn't Moses that decided, you know what, Midian, they probably have over 500,000 soldiers, but we're God's people, so we should only need about 12,000. That sounds about right to me. 12,000 against 500, 800,000, that's a pretty fair fight. I'm pretty confident this was not Moses' choice. I'm pretty confident this was the Lord's choice to pick such a small number and stack the odds like this. You're going to see from the list of Midianite spoils at the end of this chapter that Midian was a hefty-sized nation for sure. They would be working with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and it makes what happens in this chapter all the more remarkable and miraculous that God is going to use 2% of his soldiers to kill 100% of the Midianite soldiers. God wants to give Israel victory against staggering odds, and why do you think the Lord might do that? Well, number one, it's a good rehearsal for what Israel is going to be tasked with in their conquest of Canaan. The Lord is going to use Israel in very much the same way in Canaan as he's using them right now with Midian. They're going to be the sword in God's hand to execute judgment against those perverse and wicked cultures among the Canaanites. And oftentimes, the Lord's going to do the same thing. He's going to put up a very small number against a very large number, and he's going to whoop them nonetheless. And all of that is to just continually chip away at the tendency for self-trust and at the tendency for the people to look at the material and physical circumstances and base their expectations on that rather than their trust in the Lord. So this is the Lord's way of, right from the beginning, this last little rehearsal to get them ready to go into Canaan, trusting not in themselves, not in what they see, but trusting only in the Lord for all of their military success in the land of Canaan. Look at verse 3 again. It is important for us to note whose vengeance this is. Verse 3 tells us it is the Lord's vengeance on Midian, not Israel's, not Moses' axe to grind. This is the Lord's vengeance on the nation of Midian. As far as you and I are concerned, we understand what the Bible teaches us, I hope, that our place is never going to be vengeance, but it is always going to be forgiveness and then turning that situation over into the hands of the Lord. Now, the Apostle Paul puts that for us about as clearly as we could expect to have it put for us. In Romans chapter 12, verse 19, here's what Paul said, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God." Now, that is just a beautiful, crisp translation. The King James Version and the New King James Version say it like this. They say, "Give place to wrath." And it's actually a definite article there. It should be, if anything, translated, "Give place to the wrath." That does not mean don't avenge yourself, but just let the wrath go. Give place to it. Let it go. That's not what that means. That verse, there's a definite article there. What it means is don't avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath. In other words, the wrath of God. Let the wrath of God handle that. So this is just a perfect translation. Leave it to the wrath of God. And then that verse goes on to say, "For it is written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord." You'll notice from that passage, from that verse alone, and from the chapter that we're studying, that vengeance is not always a bad thing. I know we could think that because we as Christians, we're focusing on not avenging ourselves. We're focusing on not acting out in vengeance. So we could think, well, vengeance is always wrong. No, that's not true. Oftentimes, vengeance is required in order for perfect justice to be done. The problem is when human beings take vengeance into their own hands. Now, that's where the problem is, because striking the perfect balance of perfect justice is something that flawed human beings like us really just can't do. We're always going to overdo it or underdo it by a little bit to some degree, in some sense. You know we're going to. Nimrod was a good example of that. We studied him in the book of Genesis, and Nimrod was quite proud of the fact that he had killed a man for hitting him. He said, "I killed a man for hitting me. He hit me, so I one-upped him by killing that guy." He was proud of that. That's overdoing vengeance. He's a good example of someone overdoing vengeance, and he's not the only one. There are a lot of Nimrods in this world. You know that's true. Without biblical restraint, you know that our tendency is going to be to overdo it. We've talked about this multiple times in this fellowship. That's just our tendency. Well, if he did that to me, well, then I'm going to do this to him to teach him a lesson. What I do to that guy is going to be worse, just like Nimrod. So even at that stage, the Lord had to temper that human tendency to overdo vengeance by giving the law eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. As we talked about in the book of Leviticus, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, we've talked about this concept of justice, and at the time it was the tendency in every culture to overdo the taking of vengeance, and so God restrains it by saying, keep it even. If that guy knocks your eye out, well, then he needs his eye knocked out. That's perfect justice. He doesn't need his head taken off. That's overdoing it. That's overdoing vengeance. So even that, though, church, is in the context of an official criminal justice system. So God never anywhere approves or recommends vigilante justice. It's always within the context of an official, a legal criminal justice system. So if you're judge or juror, then good luck striking that balance, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life. But if you're not a judge or a juror, here's your part. As a follower of the Lord, as a servant of the Lord, forgive and leave the vengeance to God. And it's in that situation that you're going to find Romans chapter 12, verse 9, very helpful, that the Lord is going to take vengeance one day, that no one gets away with anything. The stuff that was done that hurt you, you may not see the righting of that wrong in this life, but you got to know that in the life to come, the Lord is going to make sure that no one gets away with anything. The Lord is going to judge perfectly. He's going to avenge you. Now, this is the Lord's vengeance on Midian in chapter 31. And interesting, the Lord chose Israel to be the executor or the executor of his vengeance against Midian. And by the way, he's going to do the same day one day with the church. The scripture tells us that at the second coming of Christ, the church comes back with him on white horses, and one of the things that we do is we ride with him, assisting him as executors in vengeance upon an ungodly world that has rejected him. So I would just say that day is coming if that's what you're looking for. If you're bent on seeing vengeance done for the wrongs that were committed against you, that day is coming. Until then, forgive and leave the vengeance to the Lord. Verse 6, and Moses sent them to the war, 1,000 from each tribe, together with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, with the vessels of the sanctuary and the trumpets for the alarm in his hand. Moses here appoints Phinehas to represent the Israeli army against the Midianites, and I would, ask you, does that feel like a strange choice? Because initially, I would be thinking, this would be a good time for Joshua to get his feet wet as the leader of Israel's military. This would be a great test run for him. Let him lead the army of 12,000 out there. Let him see success. Let him see victory in order to build that confidence and trust in the Lord moving into the land of Canaan. But Moses says, let's send a priest, Phinehas. Let's let him be the representative for us, the nation, coming into this battle. I'll tell you what this is, church. This is a very symbolic choice of representation. And here's what it tells me. He didn't pick Joshua because this isn't your standard battle. This isn't your normal, typical physical warfare. This is actually a spiritual battle. This is a religious battle. Because what was Midian's crime? It wasn't that they killed 24,000 Jews at the edge of a sword in a fight. They took 24,000 people from the nation of Israel down through spiritual warfare. It was a religious matter. They were seduced away from the Lord. And because it's a religious matter, because it's a spiritual matter, then Moses sends out a spiritual guy, a religious leader, the priest. And not just any priest, but Phinehas. Do you remember this guy? Where did we read about him last? Numbers chapter 25. Phinehas is the guy that when the nation had fallen through the advice of Balaam to immorality and idolatry, and there was Phinehas and the priests and Moses all at the gate of the tabernacle weeping because of the sins of the nation. And right past the gate of the tabernacle, right past the religious leaders and Moses there all weeping over their condition, here comes a guy named Zimri with a Midianite woman named Cosby. I know you remember that because you remember the joke I made. Here come these two strolling right by, and they go into Zimri's tent. There's this Jewish man, this Israelite man, caught in the act with this Midianite woman. And it was when Phinehas saw that he was enraged. He lost his gourd for the Lord. And he took a spear and he went into that tent and he speared the guy, Zimri, through the back, and the woman, Cosby, the Midianite woman, through the belly. And it was that act of a display of zeal for the holiness of the Lord that caused the Lord to stay the plague. That's what stopped the plague. It was that guy that did that. It was that guy that saved that moment for the nation of Israel. It was that guy and his zeal for the Lord that prevented further loss in that situation. So Moses says, that's our guy to finish this off. That's our guy to represent the nation before the Midianites that God is judging. That's the guy. He's off to a good start. Let's not stop him now. And just to further show that this was a religious matter, Moses has Phinehas march into battle bearing vessels from the tabernacle and the tabernacle trumpets as well. These are religious artifacts, if you will. We're not sure which vessels or implements or pieces of furniture that they might have taken into battle, but if I had a guess, I would say these would be bronze instruments. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if Moses said, go get the brazen altar, that big old square thing, go get that thing, and you carry the brazen altar into battle and the bronze laver. Why do I say those things? Because brass is the metal of judgment, and every one of those stations represented with a brass or bronze furnishing. It was all about judgment, and that's what this moment is about for Midian. It is about God executing his judgment. Verse 7, they warred against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses and killed every male. They killed the kings of Midian, verse 8, with the rest of their slain. Evi, Rechem, that is a terrific name for a destructive king, Rechem. They weren't afraid of this guy, even though his name was impressive. Evi, Rechem, Zur, who was actually the father of Cosby, the woman killed in Numbers chapter 25. Zur, Hur, and Reba. Like the music, love the show. So those were the 5 kings of Midian. And check this out, my favorite part of verse 8. What can I say? I've got that side to me. It says, they also killed Balaam, the son of Beor, with the sword. Wow. Unbelievable, huh? God was able to get to the root of the problem. Balaam, the prophet for hire, was killed with the sword. Now, I don't know if you remember back when we were studying Balaam, the word that the Lord gave him and the visions that the Lord showed him. And one of the things that Balaam said after having that first encounter with the Lord, after getting this glimpse of God's blessing over his people, the nation of Israel, Balaam said, let me die the death of the righteous and let my end be like his. You remember when he said that? Yeah, well, that did not happen. That did not happen at all. He was not a righteous person, and he dies as an enemy of God in the very act of fighting against God. He had picked his side, and it was pretty foolish of him. The Lord had shown him the prophetic future, the future state of the nation of Israel. The Lord had convinced that man, you can't take this nation down. They're going to be there to the end. I got a future for this group. You can't successfully fight against them. And Balaam believed that enough to refrain from cursing them. But now here he is with the sword in his hand. And though he wouldn't curse them, he's trying to physically kill them. So I would just say, how dumb was that guy? That is extremely, extremely dumb. But that is what sin and rebellion will do. Sin and rebellion can be very blinding and very deceiving. Also, when I think about Balaam's end here, I think about that big paycheck that he got from Balak. Remember, all of this is happening in the space of 2 months. So when Balaam took that final paycheck from Balak for helping out, he had that money for less than 2 months before he died. So all of that was for nothing. He didn't even have time to spend that money. He didn't have time to get that new pool put in. He didn't have time to get his Amazon packages. They came horseback back then. It took longer. So all of that effort for that big paycheck just completely wasted. And it would actually end up as spoils from the war that would end up going back to the nation of Israel. They would end up with Balaam's paycheck. I think that's very fitting. Well, verse 9. And the people of Israel took captive the women of Midian and their little ones, their young ones. And they took as plunder all their cattle, their flocks, and all their goods. Verse 10. All their cities and the places where they lived and all their encampments they burned with fire. Verse 11. And took all the spoil and all the plunder, both of man and of beast. Verse 12. Then they brought the captives and the plunder and the spoil to Moses and to Eleazar the priest, and he's actually the high priest now that Aaron has passed, and to the congregation of the people of Israel at the camp on the plains of Moab by the Jordan at Jericho. Verse 13. Moses and Eleazar the priest and all the chiefs of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. Verse 14. And Moses was angry, meekest man on the face of the earth, angry once again. I'll tell you, he got angry a lot. If he didn't tell us he was the meekest man on the face of the earth, I wouldn't believe it, but he told us that he was, so I believe it. He was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds who had come from service in the war. Verse 15. Moses said to them, have you let all the women live? What were you thinking? Verse 16. Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And so the plague came upon the congregation of the Lord. Verse 17. And therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. Pretty intense stuff. And I tried to give you some fair warning last week. This is another one of those passages that Bible critics like to attack. But you got to be careful with their attacks because they make their attacks by asking questions with built-in assumptions or presuppositions. So they'll ask questions like this. Why is God killing innocent people in Numbers chapter 31? And it's not just this chapter. You've heard that before, I'm sure. People criticizing the Lord for incidents in the Old Testament that are similar to this. Why is the Lord killing innocent people? And here's what I'm talking about when I say those are questions that are loaded with assumptions from the beginning. Because the truth is, who says the Lord is killing anyone that is innocent in this chapter? That is an assumption. And when you ask a question like that, if you don't know any better, if you don't know the text, if you don't know the character of God, then you might say, well, yeah, you got a point. That does look pretty ugly on God's part. But the truth is, there's no kind of evidence whatsoever that the Lord killed even one single innocent person in this chapter. I mean, hello, the women that he's killing here. The women are the very ones that are responsible for the fall of the Jewish men in Numbers chapter 25. So, above all of the other demographics, this is the demographic that the Lord is really angry with here in this chapter. You can't say that just because someone's a woman that they're innocent, can you? That's not fair. We know better. I mean, come on, just because it's a woman, that doesn't mean she's innocent. And for that matter, just because God orders the killing of young boys, that does not mean that they're innocent either. The truth is, no innocent people were killed in this chapter. I'm going to go ahead and go on record and say that. And the reason I can say that is because I have studied God's character, and I know that God never kills innocent people when he is exacting judgment and taking vengeance. That would be injustice, absolutely. And it's something that God just is not capable of doing. He's not capable of being unjust. He has proven that to us through Noah and the flood, through Lot, Sodom, and Gomorrah. He will prove that to the world in the future when he raptures the church prior to the tribulation period. That is always God's way. If he is leveling judgment, he's not going to wipe out a bunch of innocents as collateral damage in the process. He's going to pull away the righteous ones, and he's going to execute judgment perfectly on the wicked. So even if verse 17 is talking about very young children here who haven't yet been given the chance to fully live out their lives, I'm telling you, God knows what he is doing. We come back to the foreknowledge of God. We've been talking about this in many of our studies. God has perfect foreknowledge. God has had perfect foreknowledge of every person that has walked the face of the earth, not just while they were in the womb, but even before that. His foreknowledge predates the foundations of the earth being established. He has known from before he even threw down the raw materials for this planet. He has known every one of us. He has known every word that we would say in our life, every act that we would engage in. He has known every choice and decision of our heart and our mind. His foreknowledge is so perfect that he could even judge a baby in the womb before it ever lived out its life and be 100% just in his decision, in his judgment. Let me give you an example here. If God said that every single one of those Midianites needed to go, don't you just trust that that was the right call? You look like you don't, but I'm pretty sure you do. Well, let me ask you this. Young boys or not, how about Hitler? If you used what you have, not perfect foresight like God, but if you use what you have, which would be maybe close to perfect hindsight, and you had a time machine, tell me you wouldn't go back in time and have baby Hitler killed as soon as he come out of the womb, or maybe at 2 years old. Tell me you wouldn't do that. If you wouldn't do that, you've got problems. That's the right call. And God knew that baby in the womb. God knows every baby in the womb. So you might want to write this down. Because of God's perfect foreknowledge, God can be both corrective and preventive and preventative in his judgments and still always be perfectly just. So he can be corrective, that is, he can judge after the fact, or he can be preventive and judge before the fact and still be perfectly just. Now, I do want to add to that when the Lord takes the life of young children, we believe that the Bible teaches the age of accountability. So when the Lord takes the life of a young child prior to them living out a life of wickedness, We believe that the Lord takes them into heaven as this matter of innocence and being under the age of accountability where a full-on decision can be made for the Lord. So there are a lot of complex things at play when we start looking at passages like this. So instead of continuing down that road and talking about all of the different variables that God is judging in his perfect mind when he makes those kind of decisions, let me just go ahead and point out the double standard of the world. Let me go ahead and point out the hypocrisy of the world. Why does the world, the unbelieving world, the Bible critic, get angry about passages like this? They get angry because God chose to completely wipe out this evil nation. Every one of them. The women too, the young boys. But how about outside of the Bible? What does the unbelieving world get mad about concerning the judgment of God? You realize what their most common gripe against God is? That he doesn't prevent evil. You talk to someone right now and you say, okay, you're anti-Christ, you're against God, you're atheist, you were a Christian, you're no longer whatever. What's your reason? It's probably going to be this. Because if God is good, how can he let so much evil in the world happen? Have you ever heard that one? So their argument is, why doesn't God prevent evil? Why doesn't he kill the person that's going to bring evil into a situation? Do you see where I'm going with this? So outside of the Bible, it is this. Why doesn't God exercise preventative judgment to stop evil? But when they come to the Bible, their gripe against God is the opposite. Their gripe is that God executes judgment preventatively to stop evil from becoming pervasive and persistent. So I got to call out that double standard. And I got to ask, which one is it? What really bothers you about God? The fact that he does at times preemptively and preventatively take down evil by cutting it off at the feet? Or is it that God doesn't do that and he allows evil to happen in the world? Which one is it? Because you got to pick a lane as far as I'm concerned. But then again, that really is the problem, isn't it? It's not about whether God preventatively cuts down evil or whether God refuses to cut down evil. It's not about to what degree God does or doesn't do those things. Really what it comes down to is individual hearts that are obstinate in their rebellion against the Lord. It's a refusal to serve the Lord. And so, because that rebellion is there, because that refusal is there, it just becomes a matter of finding any gripe against God and his judgment that you really can. So, the truth is really that no matter what God did, you'd have a problem with him either way if you're an unbelieving critic, skeptic, or cynic. You know, if God killed Hitler at 2 years old, oh, it's so cruel. You know, why do babies die? If there's a God, why do babies die? But you let Hitler live, and 6 million Jews lose their life. And now you're mad at God for that. How could God let this happen? Do you see what I'm saying? No matter what God would decide to do, someone's going to have a problem with it. So, in hopes of offering a bit of clarification anyway, let me just put it to you like this. Here's how the world works in a nutshell. This is the world based on the understanding of Pastor Arlyn. Here's how the world works, in my opinion. God made mankind as free moral agents. He lets us make our own choices and our own decision, and as much as possible, God leaves us to our own vices and the consequences of our own vices. Now, when God sees that things are going to get bad enough, pervasive enough, that it could lead to a situation of absolute, total corruption on the planet, God in those moments decides to cut those nations off, to kill off those influences for the betterment of the rest of the planet. But until things become pervasively wicked like that, you're going to look around the world that you live in and you're going to see a lot of injustice. You're going to see a lot of human catastrophes caused by sin that comes from the heart of individuals. And so it all sort of comes back around because there is one final word about how the world works, and that is that the Lord is going to do this one more time. One final time, the Lord is going to take vengeance upon the wickedness of this world. He's going to let this world come to a state of almost total corruption, and it is then at that time, during the 7-year tribulation, that God will once and for all cut sin out by the roots. He will pour out his wrath, and you can't say that you weren't warned. Verse 18. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourself. So all of the virgin girls that have not slept with a man, the nation of Israel were to keep those young ladies for themselves. That does not imply anything immoral. The Lord never gives his people permission to do immoral things. This is another one of those passages. This was just like about a month ago, I heard some woman say, I would never serve God. I have a major problem with the Christian God. The problem I have with God is the same problem I would have with anyone. The God of the Bible ordered his people to rape. She used the word rape, to rape young girls. And he called that just. And I thought, wow, that's a new one. I mean, I've heard a lot of accusations about the Old Testament. I've heard a lot of charges of injustice coming from God. I thought just about all of them. I've never heard this one where God ordered his people to rape young girls. And then I found out her quote, she was quoting this passage, verse 18. She was, I think, because she had a dirty mind, she was assuming something dirty. She was assuming that God was speaking about immoral things here, and God definitely and certainly was not. God was giving Israel permission to take the virgin women as slaves. And before you say, well, that's terrible enough, remember our study about slavery. Slavery was an unfair institution, and what did the Lord do? He set laws around the institution of slavery so that slavery among his people was quite a bit different. It was quite a bit more fair. That these young ladies, if we just get rid of the word slavery for a moment, they were spared death. Okay, so that's one positive. They're automatically in a better situation. God allowed them to be spared from death, and now they get to be servants in Israel. And Israel is going to follow all of those laws about slavery. These young ladies are going to be treated like household guests. Yes, they're going to work. They're going to do some work. But they're going to be treated well. They're going to learn about Yahweh. They're going to have the benefit, if they choose, to serve Yahweh right alongside of the rest of the nation of Israel. So really what these young ladies would be, quote unquote, forced into is not much different than the system that you and I are forced into, which is called the American workforce. You slave for your job so that you can make some money to pay the bills. You do what your boss tells you. And there's a good chance your boss treats you far worse than the nation of Israel would have treated these young slave girls. So their lot in life is not too shabby at all. But I digress. With the battle over here, it was time for cleanup, and I mean that literally and figuratively. Let's take a look, verse 19. Oh my goodness, we've been going, we got to wrap this up here. Encamp outside the camp 7 days. Whoever of you has killed any person and whoever has touched any slain, purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, 2 very significant numbers in the Bible. Verse 20, you shall purify every garment, every article of skin, and all work of goat's hair, and every article of wood. Verse 21, then Eleazar the priest said to the men in the army who had gone to battle, this is the statute of the law that the Lord has commanded Moses. Verse 22, only the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, the tin, and the lead, everything that can stand the fire, you shall pass through the fire, and it shall be clean. Nevertheless, it shall also be purified with water for impurity. And whatever cannot stand the fire, you shall pass through the water. You must wash your clothes on the seventh day, and you shall be clean, and afterward you may come into the camp. So why was this cleansing necessary? Well, you go back to the law of Moses concerning the touching of a dead body. If you touched a dead body, you had to go through these ceremonial rites of cleansing. Now, the practical reason for that, obviously, it was just God being good to his people and preventing any kind of sicknesses and diseases that they might contract in coming in contact with dead bodies. But of course, from the spiritual standpoint, it was a powerful picture of the child of God being cleansed from the corruption, the influence of spiritual death. Now, the difference here is anything that would burn up in the fire, well, you don't have to put that in the fire. You can just wash it with water. But if it's something that's not going to burn up in the fire, then you put it in the fire. So any of your metals, you're going to run the fire through that. And we know the reason for that. When it comes to metals, symbolically, fire is what cleanses the metals. When it comes to the cloths, the garments, the wood, things like that would burn up in the fire, symbolically, it's water that cleanses those objects. And given the event itself that we're studying, you could get even more precise with the message that we take away from this section, and that would be that this is a symbolic act of being cleansed specifically from the wickedness of the Midianite culture. So it's the Lord's way of saying, don't be like the Midianites. Put all of that influence to death and cleanse yourself from it. And of course, at the end of this section and all of the things that we might interpret from it, we would just agree that we have here a wonderful picture of sanctification for the child of God. Verse 25. The Lord said to Moses, 26, take the count of the plunder that was taken, both of man and of beast, you and Eleazar the priest, and the heads of the fathers' houses of the congregation, and divide the plunder into 2 parts between the warriors who went out to battle and all the congregation, and levy for the Lord a tribute from the men of war who went out to battle, 1 out of 500 of the people and of the oxen and of the donkeys and of the flocks. Verse 29, take it from their half and give it to Eleazar the priest as a contribution or a heave offering to the Lord. Verse 30, and from the people of Israel from the people of Israel's half, you shall take 1 drawn out of every 50 of the people, of the oxen, of the donkeys, and of the flocks, of all the cattle, and give them to the Levites who keep guard over the tabernacle of the Lord. Verse 31, and Moses and Eleazar the priest did as the Lord commanded Moses. Now, I know that was a lot of reading, and it was fast. I am hurrying, but I'll summarize that real quickly. The breakdown of spoils worked like this. They were to collect everything and inventory it. Once they found out the total amount, then they were going to divide that up equally. So the 12,000 soldiers get half of all of those spoils, and then the rest of the 3 million strong nation of Israel get the other half. So obviously the 12,000 men that were out there fighting, they're getting a huge chunk of the spoils. And that's fitting. They were out there with lives on the line in order to execute the Lord's judgment. And we see here that there was a tabernacle tax on these spoils too. The soldiers gave only a 1 in 500 tribute to the tabernacle, so that is 0.2%. That's almost non-existent. But the rest of the congregants were to give 1 in 50 tribute to the tabernacle, which is 2%. So that's a pretty substantial military discount on tax day. When it's time to give this tabernacle tax, this tribute to the tabernacle, the military guys that went out and fought, they're giving almost nothing. Now, if you're familiar with the life of David in 1 Samuel chapter 30, David ran up against a similar problem. His soldiers arrived in Ziklag to find the city burned and plundered by the Amalekites. And so David pursued the Amalekites. He left with 600 men, 600 soldiers, and they came to the brook. I forget the name of the brook right now. Besor. They came to the brook Besor with 600 men. 200 of the men were exhausted, and they said, "We can't go on. We're done." And so David left those 200 men there, and he went on with 400 soldiers. And with those 400 soldiers, he overtook the Amalekites. He conquered them, and all of the spoils that they took from Ziklag and all of the spoils that they took from the Philistines before that, David and those 400 men brought all of that back to the nation of Israel. And David, when he came up against those 200 men, the 400 men that did stick out the battle, they were upset that David was going to offer those 200 men spoils from the war. And they said, "No way. We were the ones that went out and fought. They weren't with us, so they don't get the spoils. We'll let them take their women and their children, but that's it." Wow. Good guys. How nice of them. You can have your women and your children still. We won't take them from you, but you're not getting any of the spoils. Well, it was at that moment that David made this a perpetual statute for the nation of Israel, that when the military goes out to fight, whatever spoils they get, it gets shared equally among the whole nation. And I think David was probably referring back to this Numbers chapter 31 passage when he set that statute into law. It's a beautiful picture of the fact that when any one of us are a soldier for the Lord and we get a victory in the kingdom of God, that's nothing to be upset over or jealous about. That is a victory for the whole kingdom of God. We all benefit from victories in the kingdom of God. So thank God for those that are out there taking back ground for the enemy and bringing in the spoils of war. Verse 32, "Now the plunder remaining of the spoil that the army took was 675,000 sheep, 72,000 cattle, 61,000 donkeys." And don't forget, one of them is a talking donkey. Balaam's here. His donkey's here. Balaam's dead. His donkey is free for the taking. And if I'm there, I'm saying you can have the rest of the donkeys. You can take the sheep. You can take, I want the talking donkey. I want to start a podcast. It would be huge. Arlyn and the talking donkey. Or maybe just the two talking donkeys. Self-deprecating humor there. Verse 35, "And 32,000 persons in all, women who had not known man by lying with him." So that's the total of the spoils. 808,000 animals, if you do the math. 32,000 virgin women, if you do the math. Verse 36. Now this is a breakdown of the totals that we were just given. Half of those spoils goes to the soldiers, half of it, the other half to the rest of the nation. Verse 36. "And the half, the portion of those who had gone out in the army, numbered 337,500 sheep, and the Lord's tribute of sheep was 675. The cattle were 36,000, of which the Lord's tribute was 72. The donkeys were 30,500, of which the Lord's tribute was 61. The persons were 16,000, that's the women, which the Lord's tribute was 32 persons, and no doubt those women, those young ladies, would become workers, assistants for the tabernacle in some way. We know there's a lot of work they could not do, but they could become assistants to the Levites in some way or another. Verse 41, "And Moses gave the tribute, which was the contribution for the Lord, to Eleazar the priest, as the Lord commanded Moses." And now here's the breakdown of the congregation's half of the spoils. Verse 42, "From the people of Israel's half, which Moses separated from that of the men who had served in the army, now the congregation's half was 337,500 sheep, 36,000 cattle." Of course, these are going to be the same numbers, right? Because it's in half. "And 30,500 donkeys, and 16,000 persons." Verse 47, "From the people of Israel, from the people of Israel's half, Moses took one out of every 50, both of persons and of beasts, and gave them to the Levites who kept guard over the tabernacle of the Lord, as the Lord commanded Moses." Verse 48, "Then the officers who were over the thousands of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds, came near to Moses and said to Moses, 'Your servants have counted the men of war who are under our command, and there is not a man missing from us.'" Can you imagine that roll call? It's time to gather the number of casualties in the war. And everyone raises their hand. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. Not a one soldier was missing. 12,000 went to battle against hundreds of thousands, and not a one of those 12,000s were lost. So, verse 50, we have brought the Lord's offering, what each man found, articles of gold, armlets and bracelets, signet rings, earrings, and beads, to make atonement for ourselves before the Lord. In other words, we recognize this was absolutely a supernatural victory. This just could not happen anyway. This was God. God did this. God preserved our lives. Not a one of us is lost. And so to make atonement for that, in other words, to thank God for the preserving of our lives when we could have been killed, we want to bring this offering of gold. All of these things that we found. Verse 51, and Moses and Eleazar, the priests, received from them the gold, all crafted articles, and all the gold of the contribution that they presented to the Lord from the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds was 16,750 shekels. The men in the army had each taken plunder for himself. 16,750 shekels. Isn't that amazing? And you're like, I don't know what that means. Well, let me put that in American lifestyle for you. That's 420 pounds of gold. Now, I looked based on the current currency rate, and gold per pound is selling at well, here's what the total would be. This would be the equal modern times of $12 million. This was a huge offering that the tabernacle had just brought in. I think right beside the tabernacle, they should put up a recreation center with basketball hoops. But that's just me. That's a big offering. Verse 54, and Moses and Eleazar the priests received the gold, of course, from the commanders of thousands and of hundreds. They didn't turn it away, in other words, and brought it into the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, as a memorial for the people of Israel before the Lord. All right. Thank you for letting me finish the chapter. I'm going to have you stand. Very good practical lessons from this. Most of this just has to do with us trusting the Lord for our battles and then making sure that we recognize what the Lord does. The main takeaway there from these officers recognizing this supernatural act of God and then giving this free will offering that wasn't called for is sort of like very similar to things that we experience in our life. The vast majority of the things that the Lord does for us in our life, we never recognize. And Israel's going to do the same thing. They're going to get into Canaan. It's not always going to be that clear that, wow, God was involved and God gave us this victory. At times it's going to look an awful lot like they did it with military strength. They did it with military know-how. And a lot of times in life, that's what it looks like for you. Well, yeah, I got that raise because I do good on my job. Or this happened in my life because I did this, that, and the other. It's about me, and I made this happen. And we don't recognize a lot of what God does, so I want to ask us, just as a closing word here, a final point of application, that we be more careful with that. That we be more pointed in examining our life for all of those subtle ways where we can see God influencing and affecting our lives. But certainly when God does something like this in your life, that it's just so obvious that this could not have happened if it wasn't for God's supernatural involvement, then by all means, when it's clear to you like that, make sure you don't forget about the Lord. Make sure you thank Him. Bring Him your offerings of gratitude. Let's pray.